there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology. Welcome to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. Today we bring you an interview with Professor Shawn Loewen. Shawn works as an associate professor on Michigan State University's Second Language Studies program. Shawn completed his PhD under the supervision of Rod Ellis, and his research interests include Instructed Second Language Acquisition, the main theme of today's interview, as well as the effects of research methodology on understandings of SLA. Shawn's books include 2015's Introduction to Instructed Second Language Acquisition and a recent work co-authored with Luke Plonsky entitled An A to Z of Applied Linguistics Research Methods, which was published this year. Matt sat down with Shawn back in spring at Temple University's Tokyo campus after he gave his talk, Instructed Second Language Acquisition, How Effective Is It? We hope you enjoyed the interview.
Okay, so I'm Matt, and I'm sitting here with Professor Shawn Loewen at Temple University in Japan. Thank you for being with me today.
My pleasure.
First of all, could we begin by, perhaps you could describe your journey and development as a researcher in SLA,
Sure.
if possible.
Sure. Well, ever since I was a kid, I've loved languages, and I realized that I probably couldn't get a job learning languages, which was probably what I would have liked to have done. But I, in sort of high school and then going into university, I thought about being an English teacher. And so I got an English Lit degree and taught English a little bit on the side. And then as I got, after I finished that and was still interested in teaching and maybe developing a bit further, I decided to do a master's in linguistics. And at the time, my wife had suggested that I do one of those programs where you sort of get, a doctorate with a master's along the way, right. So like a 5-year program. And I said, I don't know if I really want to do that, because if you get a PhD, you're really committing yourself to research and academia, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to do that. But when I, doing my master's, I found that I loved research. Those types of assignments were the ones that I enjoyed the most in my MA classes. So I did my MA at Temple University in Philadelphia. And so I met with my advisor, and he said, oh yeah, there's this world-famous applied linguist you should probably take a class with, and that was Rod Ellis. Yeah. So I took one class with him, and that turned into a couple more classes, and he suggested that I stay on there for a PhD, and so I did that, and about halfway through my PhD, he went to the University of Auckland in New Zealand, so I followed him down there, and actually finished my PhD down there, and have sort of been doing research and SLA stuff since then.
Right.
So.
And how have your kind of interests changed or kind of developed over time?
Well, when I first started, my initial idea for a topic for my PhD was looking at social identity, because I just found it really fascinating how people position themselves with language, how they make sense of their lives and their sort of interactions with language. Mm-hmm. And when I went to New Zealand, I was Rod's RA, research assistant, and he had me working on this Focus on Form project. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, I was doing reading on social identity and all of that. And one day he said, Shawn, you don't seem to be getting very far on this whole social identity thing. Right. What would you think about changing your topic to Focus on Form or something like that? And it was really hard for me because I sort of viewed myself as a sociolinguist. I'm like, this is going to totally reframe who I am. And I asked a couple of people, and they're like, what, are you crazy? You should totally take this and run with it. Yeah. So, and I like it because I like being close to the classroom. I obviously haven't taught languages for a while now, but I get to go into classrooms, I get to talk with teachers, and I really like that. And now I can just sort of dabble in social identity and those types of things. Bonnie Norton was just at Michigan State to give a talk, and I really enjoy hearing about that type of stuff, and it's kind of nice that I don't have to actually research in it. I can just enjoy it.
Yeah, I see. Great. Okay, perhaps we'll come back to a point you mentioned about not being in the classroom later. I have a question about that. But
Sure.
You recently offered a book titled Introduction to Instructed Second Language Acquisition. And that was your talk yesterday. I wonder if you could kind of briefly tell us the premise of the book and why ISLA is kind of a prevalent topic at the moment.
Sure. Well, Rod Ellis, not only being my mentor for my PhD, but he sort of continues on with you after you
Right.
become a professor as well. And he's like, Shawn, you need to write a book. I'm like, well, I don't know what I would write a book about. And it took me a while. And then, I thought about doing something on focus on form, but that seemed a bit narrow. And as the years went by, this topic of instructed SLA, I kept seeing it referred to, but nobody had really given a good definition of it. It was just sort of an assumption that everybody knew what it was. And so I started thinking about it and how it related to different types of instruction in the classroom. And instructed SLA had been used a lot in terms with grammar. And I thought, if this is a thing that we should be interested in and framing our research in, then it needs to apply equally to other areas of language and other aspects, like looking at individual differences, those types of things. So I decided that I finally had something that I wanted to explore in a book. And so my attempt was to bring together a variety of different topics under this instructed SLA umbrella, and to try and set a framework or a definition as a starting point in the conversation for a term that's been around, but hasn't been perhaps made clear exactly what it is. And I think the importance of it is, language teaching continues to be, a very important and popular activity. Lots of people are still learning second languages, and I think we have a responsibility as researchers to make sure that best practice is happening in the classroom, and that we can talk with teachers about what works, what doesn't work in the classroom. And not that I'm always careful, I don't want to be the researcher coming in and telling teachers this is what you should do, but rather to say these are some of the things that research says and that theory suggests. What do you think of this? What are your experiences with this? So,
and I remember yesterday you asked the audience, what do you think ISLA is? And there were a lot of kind of definitions that people came up with. What would be your definition in a nutshell, if possible?
I think one thing is that it's important for me that it's sort of theoretically and empirically based.
Yeah.
So it has something to support it, not just, these are some ideas about what I should do in the classroom.
Okay.
And, a lot of teachers, I think myself included, when we first start teaching, I walked in, my first English teaching job was in Mexico, and I walked into a school and never taught anything, related to language before my life, and within half an hour I was in the classroom. Yeah. So, I had no idea what to do. And so, part of the process of training teachers is that there's something to back up, what we do. This isn't a nutshell, apparently.
No, it's fine.
But that's a premise for me. But then what is, instructed SLA? It's dealing with anything where there's some type of manipulation of the learning context and learning environment. So the standard traditional context might be the language classroom, which we're all familiar with, but I also see it as including self-study or the use of technology. Yeah. So anything where there is some type of intervention, maybe however small, that is aimed at helping a learner to improve their second language abilities.
Right, I see. And you, some of the components of an ISLA approach, I'm not sure if that's the right word, are systematic manipulation, learning mechanisms, and learning conditions. I wonder if you could kind of unpack those areas.
Sure. So what was the first one? This was my definition. I should know. Systematic manipulation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess it's just the idea that, as I said previously, that there are things that are being done to help the learner with the learning process, and the things that teachers can manipulate in the classroom. A lot of it's related to input. So what types of input do learners get? Is it authentic input? Is it manipulated in some way? Is it metalinguistic in nature, rather than actual, communicative language? So those types of things, teachers have the ability to control, and also to a certain extent the output that learners produce. So are we asking them to produce language? Are we, what type of language are we asking them to produce? Are we just having them repeat rules, or try to use try to use the language communicatively? So those are some of the types of manipulations I think that can then occur. As far as the learning mechanisms, there's sort of two things here, and this I think is maybe less relevant for teachers, but thinking about how we process language and how that affects what happens in the classroom, and that's probably more on the theoretical side. But what is it about how learners pay attention to language, how our minds process language, and what do we know about that we can turn to our advantage in the classroom? So things like Schmidt's noticing hypothesis, where we try to help learners to notice specific features in the input, and also then how is language restructured in the brain? So how do we store it? How is it kept there? And then the learning conditions is just really the classroom context, the use of technology, the different types of activities and tasks. Task-based language teaching, I think, would fall in there. And how do we, manipulate tasks to help encourage learners to use the language productively in ways that's going to help, in ways that are going to help them improve their accuracy and proficiency.
Yeah. Okay. And you preface your book by saying that you write from a cognitive interactionist perspective or tradition. What are some of the characteristics of this perspective over other?
So
perspectives?
One of the things that a cognitive interactionist perspective is interested in, I would say probably the primary focus, is what happens in the learner's brain when they're learning. And so in that sense, at its worst, I think the approach can be decontextualized and take really no account of the social context that learners find themselves in. Right. So it's all about what's happening internally. And the cognitive approach has been accused of ignoring the social aspect of learning, and I think perhaps that's a fair criticism. But there is some effort made to look at social factors, but it's I would contrast it with maybe like a socio-cultural theory approach, where that approach is much more interested in the interaction that's happening between people as a way of co-constructing knowledge. And that's not something that, as a cognitivist, I would really, that's not my approach to learning.
And you mentioned yesterday that you had a conversation with Lantolf about the inclusion of socio-cultural theory into ISLA, and I think you mentioned that he kind of convinced you. So
yes.
How did that conversation play out?
Well, I'm working on a handbook of Instructed Second Language Acquisition for Routledge, and I invited Jim and one of his students to contribute a chapter on concept-based instruction. And I wasn't really familiar with it, and in my book, I didn't include sort of socio-cultural theory. And in one sense, I was relieved not to have to do so, because it's hard when you're trying to write something from a different theoretical perspective than your own and trying to do it justice. But and I would say that socio-cultural theories seem to provide some general ideas and mechanisms for the classroom. I mean, they're obviously very interested in the classroom, but I didn't see any specific ways in which teachers could actually say, okay, here's something from socio-cultural theory that I could apply to the classroom.
Right.
And Jim's chapter showed me that things have progressed with sociocultural theory, and there are some applications to the classroom. And so I'm looking forward to. I've actually been contracted to do a second edition of the book,
right.
And so I'm thinking about how I'm going to include a chapter on sociocultural theory. And so I'm not that I'm thinking about doing it. I'm going to include one, but I'm thinking
right.
about how to structure that and what I need to do some investigation into how things have progressed in even the last few years since I was writing the book, and it's only been out a year and a half.
Yeah,
but it's a field that is really there's a lot of activity.
And a question I was thinking of yesterday during your talk is how sensitive is ISLA to kind of local kind of teaching traditions around the world? Like, I think different countries have different ways of teaching. I wonder, has there kind of been any kind of meta-analysis from a lot of different kind of contexts around the world?
I would say that the concern has maybe been more at the level of the individual researcher.
Right.
So some researchers are, interested, for example, in, classroom instruction in East Asia, for example. And in the upcoming handbook, we have Yuko Goto Butler has contributed a chapter on instruction in East Asia and sort of some of the differences and challenges that may happen. And again, I would say that context is certainly something that we should be taking into account and considering. One of the things is, if we believe that communication is important for learners to do in order to develop communicative proficiency, how do we deal with cultural contexts where the approach towards education is much more memorization based and top down, and that, not that that's necessarily a wrong perspective, but it doesn't necessarily help learners to achieve proficiency in language. And so how do we work with and in those contexts to help learners develop their linguistic competence?
Yeah, I see. Yeah, and you talked about some kind of methods that aren't kind of included in ISLA. I think some of the examples you gave were audiolingualism, and I guess the methods of that kind of often kind of observed kind of in a historical kind of with a historical lens. I'm wondering if ISLA can kind of validate these methods once and for all. Is that possible?
I don't think in academia there's ever anything that is once and for all.
No, sure, yeah.
Theories come and go, and ideas about language learning come and go, but and I mean, Chomsky's universal grammar, and all of that was a big revolution, if you will, in linguistic theory, and it changed the landscape of L1 and L2 acquisition research. And who knows if something similar is going to come along and totally change our perspective. And so it's important, I think, to acknowledge that some of these. I'm not saying that these, audiolingualism or total physical response or even crazy English, for example, are unworthy of research. And, certainly we need to, if we're going to exclude certain methods, we should know why. But certainly there are some methods that seem to get a lot of buzz for whatever reason, but that don't really have much research that's supporting them or a lot of interest in researching that topic because it's not really viewed from a theoretical perspective.
Right, I see. Yeah, I think that came up yesterday, the idea of buzz versus being empirically based.
Right,
in that kind of dichotomy.
Yeah.
I want to go back to a point you mentioned at the start where you said you kind of concede that you're not a teacher, but you're more of a researcher. I was thinking, is ISLA a way to kind of make a pathway between research and practice?
Definitely, from my perspective. One of the goals of the book is to sort of bridge that gap, coming from a researcher's perspective, because that's, I own that perspective. That's who I am. That's how I look at things. But also to put it in a way that hopefully is accessible to teachers, and that can hopefully start a dialogue or continue a dialogue that teachers have maybe from their master's training or whatever type of professional development that they're involved in. And I think it's really important that contact between teachers and researchers. And I was just doing some research with a colleague at a university in Chile, and I was able to sit in on some of the instruction, and I realized that I hadn't sat in a language classroom for quite some time, and it was really nice to be back in and just be reminded of some of the realities of the classroom, that when we're sort of distilling things in a research context, we tend to forget.
Right.
So, but as I said earlier, I would stress again, I don't really view myself as the expert coming in and telling teachers this is what you should do. I'm much more interested in having a dialogue with teachers and saying, here's what I think about things based on my perspective and my research. What do you think of this, and what are your experiences with this? And why would or wouldn't this work in your context?
Right. Have you had any kind of success stories from maybe teachers or a group of teachers taking on your research and ideas?
I haven't done any post-testing on it,
Right, okay,
but I've had some really good conversations, especially around corrective feedback. That seems to be a topic that teachers are really interested in. And actually, recently I did a sort of a 1 and a half hour little seminar on Instructed SLA, and with a group of teachers at a university, in a language school within a university, and we had a really good discussion about these different issues, and how much they changed, or I don't really know, and it's hard for me to gauge when I come in and do an hour and a half of professional development or something. But I was really happy that I felt like I had connected with people, we had discussed these issues, and really my goal is to challenge them to think about these things, and so I think we did that. So whether that changes their practice a day, a week, a month later, I don't really know.
Right. Yeah. In your talk yesterday, you talked about technology as being one of the manipulative factors in ISLA, and yesterday you talked about some of your dissatisfactions with particular types of technology. For example, Duolingo, which I think we talked about in a previous podcast episode.
Really?
What are these shortcomings, I guess? Can you give any examples? Or
sure.
Not just Duolingo, I mean.
Yeah. What I find frustrating about some of these programs that are sort of out there in the mainstream culture or mainstream marketplace for language instruction is that they don't seem to have a strong theoretical underpinning, and so some of them are based a lot on repetition, sort of an audiolingual approach, where you're just repeating sentences, and it doesn't really matter what they are. So with Duolingo, for example, I'm doing a project with my students in one of my classes this semester, and so we're studying Turkish on Duolingo.
Right, yeah.
And some of the sentences that we get to translate are just... So I am going to show the example of one I was working on this morning, and one of the sentences, the cat is waiting at the bus stop. And I'm just like, or the duck speaks Italian. And I'm just like, why are we dealing with these inane sentences when you could be doing so much more communicatively to help us as learners make sense, to make connections that are going to help us with, communicating. Another example, I evaluated a program that claims to be the largest English online program for Spanish speakers in the Americas. And really professionally done, media really slick, and not in a bad way, but just really high quality. But there were so many missed opportunities for engaging learners in, communication or sort of extended opportunities to talk about things. And they actually had sessions where they would, I forget if it was text chat or audio chat with a native speaker or a teacher.
Okay.
And so, it was a bit formulaic, and I was just like, this is such a missed opportunity with such great materials to not do more with, just, again, there was a lot of just repetition of stuff that you could have really engaged with a bit more as a learner.
Do you think that maybe these kind of developers kind of listen to the learners as customers and kind of gear towards the marketing rather than the theory of it, perhaps, or?
Possibly, ones that are charging, certainly. So they're giving, I would expect that they might have more grammar focus, for example, because that might be what the learners think they need.
Yeah.
But things like Duolingo, which are free, I don't know who's designing their program, their materials, and I don't know, sort of what basis they're using for their materials. It sort of feels like they're tech people who have decided to get into the language business, and maybe have had. I know the Open English, the one geared for Spanish speakers, is started by a Venezuelan guy, and so I would imagine he's probably drawing on his own experiences of learning English, which may or may not have been, ideal.
I see. So. Yeah. So that was one of the dissatisfactions you kind of talked about yesterday, and in the latter part of your talk, you talked about language education in the US and how better things could be done. I wonder if you could talk about that. Again, this is a big topic.
Yeah. Let me just go back to the technology thing to say one thing positive.
Sure.
Because I remember when I was a high school student, I wanted to take French, and there was one semester I think that it was offered, and so, but I just remember the scarcity of resources to get anything, French related. And so now with technology, I mean, in one sense it's unfathomable that I can be studying Turkish, with and having access to materials in Michigan.
Right.
So it has opened up that opportunity, I think. So that's been a positive thing. Language education in the U.S.
I think your point was you were talking about explicit and implicit knowledge and that kind of teaching.
Yes, and I think that was, I'm not intimately familiar with the Japanese context, but I think a similar situation exists here in that a lot of what teachers do in the classroom, a lot of what learners expect in the classroom is explicit focus on grammar, on vocabulary, and so there's this emphasis on grammar rules, there's this emphasis on explicit knowledge, which I don't think is wrong in and of itself. I mean, I'm a linguist, I like explicit information about language, but I think the problem is when we think that that is going to bring learners to a point of communicative competence, then we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. And so, I mean, there are other factors in the U.S., such as I don't think there's a lot of larger societal value of bilingualism, and also there's not as much opportunity to interact with other speakers of the target language. Right. But nevertheless, there should be something in classrooms that is happening that allows learners to develop their communicative competence and not to just learn rules. I remember some research that I did in some Spanish classes in the U.S., and I sat in on a whole semester's worth of classes, and towards the end of the semester, in the second half of the semester, they were getting a new verb tense and verb mood every week. Right. And I thought, these poor kids, they haven't even mastered really the present tense. Yeah. And here they're getting, perfect subjunctive or something like that. Right. They have no idea. They can't use this communicatively. They'll be able to maybe reproduce it on a test because they've memorized it. Yeah. And I don't know how we're doing on time, but so also, my daughter was taking high school Spanish, and she was really struggling, and I was helping her, and it went against everything that I believe in as a linguist. But finally, I said, look, here's the conjugations for this verb. What you need to know is this is the form for this, the first person form. This is this form. Memorize this. That's what you're going to need. That's what you're going to be tested on. That's what you need to know. Forget this communicative stuff that I believe in. That's going to help her actually use the language. She needed to pass the class, and to pass the class, she had to memorize, the conjugations.
Yeah.
So.
And you talked about some of the controversies that explicit doesn't always lead to implicit. Some people said yes, some people said no.
Right.
And you kind of talked about like the interface hypothesis and those kind of controversies.
Right.
Right. What are those? I guess that's it.
So the idea is, explicit knowledge is easy to teach, right? But the question, and implicit knowledge is hard to teach. It takes time to develop. So the question is, can we teach explicit knowledge and then help it to turn into implicit knowledge? And so skill acquisition theory, for example, would say that yes, you can start with, in fact, they argue that you have to start with declarative knowledge, and then that becomes proceduralized and automatized. And I find that somewhat problematic in that I think learners don't always start with declarative knowledge. I think there are some things that maybe even in a foreign language classroom that learners can develop implicit knowledge of. But I don't hold a strong non-interface position that explicit knowledge can never become implicit. And I'm not so hung up on identifying whether the knowledge is implicit or explicit, but what I want to find out and research more on is how do we get learners, if it's proceduralized explicit knowledge, great. If they can, whatever they can use to help them develop their proficiency, that's what I'm interested in, not necessarily whether it's how it's labeled or whether it has become implicit knowledge from being explicit knowledge, those types of things. But I think I think that we as researchers and teachers need to think about what are our goals for our learners and what's going to get them there. And large doses of metalinguistic instruction is not going to bring about communicative competence.
I think the argument you were making is someone in the audience said that implicit teaching is, they were saying explicit teaching was more difficult, but I think effective implicit teaching is kind of what ISLA is. Would that be correct?
Well, I would say it's effective explicit and implicit instruction.
Right.
And because, in writing the book, I was actually surprised that there were more studies that found benefits for explicit instruction than I would have imagined. And on the one hand, I think that's good because, there is a lot of explicit instruction happening. And let's face it, there are learners who do gain communicative proficiency in classes that are largely, based on explicit instruction and explicit knowledge. But I guess I wonder how many more students would gain some communicative competence if there were methods in the classroom that were helping them more develop their implicit knowledge. So it wouldn't just be those learners who probably have high language aptitude, maybe high motivation, but it could be, a wider range of students. I think what the question, if I remember correctly, was from an L1 speaker of English who I don't think had received a lot of instruction in English grammar and metalinguistic terminology, and so that's hard to teach. If you haven't been trained in it yourself, native speakers don't have any explicit knowledge of their language unless they've been instructed in it or done a lot of self-reflection. So that is hard to teach if you haven't been trained. In that sense. Okay, just to end, what advice or guidance would you give language teachers and or researchers who are interested in becoming more active in ISLA? Obviously read your book. Sure, yes, read the book for starters, that would be great. I think it's about a continual dialogue. I think that I know teachers are busy. I know it's hard for them to find time to read research articles, and often research articles aren't written in ways that are accessible to teachers. They're written for other researchers.
Yeah.
But I think that, having professional development opportunities, trying to read things that are more aimed at teachers, and I think also reflecting on their own practices, which again is hard. There's a lot of stresses and time constraints on teaching, but I think that having an ongoing dialogue, listening to podcasts like this, for example, are ways that teachers can get outside input, outside perspectives, and again decide, well, what's in here for me, what feels relevant to my situation. What do I make of what this guy's saying?
Yeah.
So.
Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll end it there. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Shawn. Yeah, that was great.
All right.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. We'd also like to thank Professor Shawn Loewen again for agreeing to participate in the interview. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can send an email to TEFLology@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Twitter @TEFLology, or like our Facebook page, which is the TEFLology Podcast on Facebook. We also have a website, TEFLology-podcast.com, where all of our interviews and all of our regular episodes are archived. So thank you for listening. We'll be back with a regular episode soon.